Right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Justin Fazzari. We're doing a webinar today on mischaracterized BSL analysis and tools. I'd like to thank you for joining. And to kick it off, we'll start with some introductions. I'm Justin Fazzari, the Senior Broadband Strategist located in Omaha, Nebraska. And off to David.
Hi, Al. I'm David Lukens. I'm a senior data scientist at Sanborn, and I'm in Hartford, Connecticut.
And I am Caitlin Sangiolo. I am a solutions manager with the AppGeo division of Sanborn. I am in Lyndonville, Vermont.
Thanks, folks. Just to kick it off and sort of go through our agenda today, we're going to talk about this issue of mischaracterized BSLs and the guidance that the NTIA provided. Talk about the analysis that we've developed to help address this issue. Look at the processing tools that we have available, and then dig a little bit into the value proposition. But I will say this is really about efficiency, accuracy of your state broadband map, and really stretching that BEAD dollar as far as possible. And through this webinar, you'll be able to sort of see and understand how we can support going about this and really making your BEAD funding as efficient as possible. As most of you folks probably know, NTIA issued final proposal guidance recently, and within that guidance, David, there's a lot of information, but maybe if we could just dig into it for a second, sort of, what are some of the issues that are brought up there around the issue that we're talking about today? What challenges you see ahead? Maybe just touch on initially at least some of the benefits of going through this data analysis and mapping exercise. Maybe provide just a quick example. So I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. So I think the biggest thing that we see in the updates, right? So there was final proposal guidance version 1, and then they released in quick succession 1.1 and 1.2 that give you the option as a state broadband office to try and deal with some of the irregularities that are going to come out of a challenge process. So those might be locations that are served. They just couldn't file challenges to say that they were planned service because it was too far out in the time frame. They could be locations that are funded, or they could be locations that are rock. And so I think those non-BSLs were the biggest addition here that we weren't really sure if there was going to be space to deal with. And this new guidance gives us a whole bunch of more documentation to do, more evidence gathering, more creation of long lists of location IDs with appended data. But this allows us to handle those locations that are eligible, but that should not be funded. We know as a state that there's no reason for federal dollars to go towards this. It's not going to improve anybody's life. So we want to make sure that we can then focus our funding on the right type of locations. And between versions 1.1 and 1.2, there was some messiness around whether it was possible for a state to publish a list of these locations and say, hey, if you're bidding on a project during subgrantee selection, maybe you should consider this additional data. After a few back and forths with NTIA and various states that we've already worked with, they have confirmed that it's totally acceptable to publish and indicate these locations as part of your subgrantee selection process, which makes this a really good opportunity to do a couple of things. First, it's going to give you that opportunity to make sure that you dig into the data and let people know what the state of that data is, if this is a questionable location or not. But it's also going to give you the opportunity to have a back and forth with ISPs that otherwise would have been left until contract negotiation, where suddenly you're trying to figure out what they're actually going to serve. They come up and say, there's no neighborhood here. There are 20 different BSLs, but those are all tents. And so now that can be removed or at least prepared for in advance. You can get that data to the ISPs, tell them to give you feedback, and try and sort through all of this data. But of course, it then does come with the burden of now you're going to have to file some FCC challenges. You're going to have to create this no BEAD location CSV as part of your final proposal. But I think, it's probably worth the trouble because this might save states 30, 40,000 locations that they otherwise would have had to plan to fund, and now they can make sure that that funding is going to the right location.
Thanks, David. As we go to the next slide, I just want to mention that there is a Q&A, and please submit your questions in there, and we'll address them at the end. So appreciate any questions that folks can submit. Okay, so taking this next step forward, David, on sort of what you've really covered, but what we're talking about here is locations that are eligible after the challenge process. And states don't intend to serve them via BEAD due to one of the following reasons, which you kind of went over. They should have not been, they're uninhabitable. There might be support structures, something like that. They do not require mass market broadband, such as CAIs or enterprise customers. They're no longer in the fabric. They're already funded. As you know, funding keeps going on from many different sources. And then they're served. And so that sort of is really the framework of what we're talking about here. And with that, David, let me just pass it over to you to dig into a little bit more detail on this.
Sure. So
the next slide.
All of those categories you mentioned are basically reason codes. And so in that CSV that you're going to have to submit with your final proposal, you're going to have to populate a reason code and all these other things to try and figure this out. And so of states that we've looked at, and some of this work with, for CPF before we even started doing this for BEAD, but something like 10 to 15%, in some states it's higher, some states it's lower. It seems to be a little bit based on density, how high this number goes. More dense places seem to have a higher number. But 10 to 15% of eligible locations in the states that we're looking at have a very good reason to be removed. And it's usually accounting for over 20% of the cost plus cost model for that state. So significantly reducing the number of locations that need to be funded, and also taking out some of those really big, expensive outlier locations so that you can more effectively figure out your extremely high cost threshold, make sure that you're getting fiber to the places, as many places as possible that you want to be getting fiber. And so, reviewing all of those locations is difficult. It's time consuming, and there's just a lot of data involved. There's no magic bullet here. There's not, if somebody tries to sell you on like AI is going to fix it for you, this data is so irregular and so strange. Like there's no reason why some of these rocks should be BSLs. They don't have vertices. So it's really difficult to have some sort of magic solution. But if you build out the number of data sets that you're working with enough, you get enough supporting evidence to try and say, all right, we have a very good reason to think X number of locations are invalid. And that gives us the opportunity to also then pull all of those data sets as potential evidence that can be used to the NTIA. Because the NTIA has been very clear, they don't want to just see a satellite image and you saying, and the state saying, all right, we don't think this is serviceable. That's not enough. It's probably not new enough. It doesn't mean they won't consider it, but we need to be able to really bring the whole kitchen sink in terms of evidence. Google Street View, OpenStreetMap, parcel data. And then if we can collect information from landowners, anything we can get to try and really get a complete picture of these locations. And so it creates a really significant challenge for states.
Thanks, David. I think we want to sort of jump into a little more detail on the analysis, but it's interesting because sort of what you're saying is pulling as much data available as possible to look at this, but it can't be 100% automated process. It really needs the human element to review these, and like you said, these are so not regular as far as data analytics go. You really need to have your sort of hands on this as you go through the process of the analysis. So with that, let's get into some of the details.
Sure. And I think, what you're saying is it's especially true when you're talking about locations that, we might score somewhere in the mid-range, and we'll get to that. But some of these locations, you can be pretty sure because there's no building footprint. The parcel data says it's vacant. We can do feature extraction and find no vertices connected, right? We can do all of those things and be pretty sure, but there's going to be this really soft middle that you need to find a way to review. Sorry, go ahead. So then the idea that we started with was there has to be a way to provide some sort of uniform scoring to every eligible BSL in any state by quickly pulling together as many data sources as we can, scripting data pulls from things like OpenStreetMap, Google Street View, anything we can find, pulling all of that stuff together using partial data, using building footprints, using imagery and LiDAR in locations where none of our footprint data sets have a footprint, but there's a BSL just to double check, and pulling all of that stuff together so that we can create category codes or reason codes and location types to match with the NTIA's requirements. And then beyond that, choose the best location type and give it a confidence code based on the number of sources and the quality of sources that would agree with that decision. And so just in a very simple way, we're taking all of these data sources, applying it to those single locations, and using that to develop a classification. And so on the next slide, the simplest possible example of this is something that you see a lot in the BSL data. Even though by CostQuest's rules, there can't be two individual structures in a single family home neighborhood in the same parcel that are both BSLs. We see it a lot anyway. And so in these cases, these are homes and detached garages or sheds. And by simply imputing a bunch of information, how large is the footprint? Is it in a shared parcel? How many vertices does the footprint have? Because we know that there might be a really large barn, and we don't want to assume that that barn is the BSL. So we need to take account of distance to the road, number of vertices, all of those things. And just by doing that, we can immediately select 4 of those locations and impute to these locations. All right, these are secondary structures. These are reason code 1, location type U, or non-BSL code U. And we can use that to then start populating this data. And so then we have to think about all of these different types of locations that the NTIA has set out and think about what they would mean, how they will apply, and how much money they're currently costing in your cost model when you're putting all of these locations out and thinking, all right, how much are we going to have to spend to cover all of our locations? And so some of these categories, they're going to be a little bit goofy. Non-habitable locations. At first we thought, I don't know, I don't think, maybe there's not a lot that this would immediately apply to. But then if they are residential properties that have something like a dock on the river, that dock is not habitable. And that can either be a utility structure or a non-habitable structure. In other cases, we're going to be able to find publicly owned land with small building footprints. We know there's sheds. We know it's shared use building on campgrounds. Those are non-habitable structures, and we can identify those. And in this case, just a simple example, these 2 locations are currently eligible for BEAD funding, and they're currently accounting for $31,000 of the cost model that the state is planning to work with. Similarly, we're also going to be looking for reason code 2, and those are then enterprise locations, CAIs, and government buildings. There are a lot of big box stores across the US that are currently BSL. These are not locations that require broadband, and they wouldn't be a mass market location anyway. So being able to identify those is really important. Parcel data can be helpful here, but a lot of big box stores lease their land. So we need to be able to identify large building footprints, usually large distance from main roads, large parking lots, and pull all of that data together and find these locations. In some states, we've seen as many as 2,000, 3,000 of these locations, gone back to do some verification and check how we're calculating things, and they're 95% actually big box stores. And so this one location is $25,000. But again, if you think about that, If you multiply that by 1,000, we're getting into very large amounts of funding very quickly. Similarly, CAIs are still represented in really weird ways in the fabric. When we think about universities, a lot of the universities, they've been cleaned up since version 2, version 3. If you've been following the fabric, you'll see this. But a lot of buildings are still just remaining one by one. This one's not super expensive. It's only $7,000, but you see these large complexes of footprints that are associated with particular parcel and land values, and a lot of there are good federal data sets for finding university campuses, et cetera. So we're able to isolate those complexes of building footprints, figure out where those locations are and which ones are missing from the CAI data set and are being put in the wrong data set of the BSL. Other government-owned property is really significant. A lot of these, like, water filtration centers, different treatment centers, those are really common in the BSL, in the cost-plus fabric. And being able to isolate those, there are federal data sets that can help do this. They're usually not actually spatial, and you have to do some work with them. Then there are some spatial data sets that you can pull in and try and match. And then when you match this with parcel data, building footprints, and the rest of the data sources we're talking about, you can highlight a very large section of your BSLs that are actually just government-owned property and probably don't require broadband. And they certainly wouldn't be a mass market broadband connection. Then we get to everyone's favorite, all of the things that everyone has seen since the fabric first came out, landforms. This is category code R or reason code 1, location type R, is just landforms. This is no building footprint. They're either agricultural, vacant, they're rocks, piles of wood, bales of hay. These are the hardest to find because it's really hard to prove a negative. You can find that a location doesn't have a footprint, but then you have to find some mechanism to make sure there's actually nothing there. And so the really important thing that we're trying to do here is we identify these locations, we score them based on a bunch of different characteristics, and then we redo the feature extraction dynamically based on a very small area and just say, okay, is there anything in this little tiny area where the BSL would be? Can we find any vertices? And it's not perfect, but then we can use NAPE data. We can cycle through different types of imagery to see is anything showing up anywhere in these locations so that we can have a higher level of certainty that there really isn't a location. This is similar. It's just a great one because of the price tag, $317,000 for this tree. And there are a lot of these in the fabric that are really skewing how states are planning for their rollout of BEAD funds. Another thing that we see a lot of are different types of support structures. And so in this case, we're looking at, a grain silo and a little barn, and we need to be able to make sure that we account for the BSL that is in that parcel. There is a BSL somewhere. Somebody needs internet probably somewhere in that area, but then we want to make sure that we're only choosing one primary location and finding how to get rid of smaller footprints, footprints that have very few vertices and have big barns, or that are very far from the road and very small. So we're looking for a few different sets of characteristics that when combined are going to equal things like sheds, silos, and barns. This is a similar one, which I particularly liked just because it looks so desolate. There's no way that there should be anything there. There's a little radio tower in the middle of all of that, and $107,000. And this is maybe my favorite. Mobile structures. And so this is a super difficult thing to get your head around, in that, like, well, what all would that mean until you see this picture. And this is an actual semi-truck that probably was there 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, whenever the imagery that was used by CostQuest to create this point, it was there, and now it's gone. And so what we can do is we can look for locations that would tend to have moving objects that would get picked up by something that was looking for vertices. So we look on the right of ways, we look in waterways, we look in camping areas where there are tents and RVs, and we use those to sort of zero in on these mobile structures.
And David, I'll just to sort of step in here for a second. You know, as we go through these examples, I think it's important to note, you know, this $20,000, $30,000, $100,000 here and there really starts adding up into real money that could be, you know, used much more effectively. So I want to make sure we keep pulling it back that, you know, we're talking about real dollars here. This isn't a minimal exercise that, you know, you're going to get a real payoff. And by payoff, we mean we're not talking about extra money, new money, but we are talking about more efficiently using, you know, the allocation that you have. So just want to make sure that we're really hitting on that because that's a real important part of this.
That's a great point. And I think, you know, the thing is with all of these is that one or two wouldn't be a big deal. But when you when you multiply an average of around 20 grand by say 10,000 locations, 20,000 locations, maybe 50,000 locations, you're talking about a huge percentage of BEAD allocations in most states. And in many states where you're trying to stretch to see, you know, what percent can we actually get fiber to, it's definitely not that you're getting new money back. But imagine if you planned based on these locations as is and got fiber to 50% of your locations when you could have gotten it to 80% by removing those locations and planning more effectively with your funding. Because you don't need to fund this really weird tadpole shaped island. There's nothing there. And there are a lot of these in coastal states. Obviously, if you are not so lucky to have coastal states, you won't have the islands. But even in states that we work with that are inland and have a lot of lakes, we're seeing docks and boats and all sorts of other things that are in water features that are getting classified as locations. And again, they're just completely throwing off the basic math to try and figure out where your BEAD funding should go. Another one of the reason codes is locations that are already served. And so this is going to take a few different forms. The NTIA's guidance says that for this to be applied, they have to be in the most recent version of the BDC. So that means this might require some communication with providers. But a lot of the locations that we see like this are, you know, support buildings in a condo. There's no way that those two red dots in this picture are not served. But what has happened is that the fabric versions change and the relationship of the address in that data set to the address in an ISP's data set doesn't match. And as much as people would like to put some sort of malevolent spin on how ISPs have reported for BEAD, it was never something that they were prepared to do to transition to this type of data set, especially when it is so irregular. You know, naming conventions, I'm sure everyone here knows, in the fabric are completely new. There's just a completely new way of addressing in that it's number, street, building 2, building 3. And nobody had ever used that before, which means that in a lot of cases, we're just getting completely incorrect addresses in the fabric, which makes it really hard for an ISP that isn't super good at spatial analysis to actually effectively match to those locations. And so they're not doing checks like this to say, we know we serve these 25 green dots. Are there red dots nearby that we need to make sure are served? And so I think it's really important for states to take the first step there and then create a mechanism by which you can receive good evidence to make sure that, you know, nobody's pulling wool over your eyes, but just you don't need to fund this garage in this condo. It's $54,000. And so we see this a lot with condos, MDUs, and in dense single family home areas. But also on the next slide, we see it a lot with, thanks, Caitlin. We see it a lot with locations that are relatively new. So, you know, this is a relatively new neighborhood. The structures are all there, people are living there, but the total sum of locations here that are eligible accounts for $400,000. And it's really important. I don't think that fixed wireless should be accounted for in this way. You don't want to assume you know where fixed wireless is getting to and how all of that works. This is all fiber. So there's fiber going down half this street, half that street to 5 of these houses in a cul-de-sac and not the other 2. So that's also a really important use case. And also, back to that previous slide, Caitlin. There's also some important analysis that needs to be done for funding locations. Obviously, most states have ongoing funding programs that need to be checked and included, but you should have that data, right? That's okay. But another important factor here is that federal programs like RDOF, they're based on census block groups, which means they go to the road. In most cases, census block groups boundaries are generated by rights of way. And that means that on the other side of the right of way, they're not in the census block, but infrastructure is likely on that road. You don't want to overpay a provider who just got a federal grant on the other side of the road and has run cable or fiber down that road when they could just pull it across the street. That's not always going to be the case, but I think there are some really important analyses that need to be done to check federal funding sources and their proximity to other eligible locations to make sure that there's not really service available there, or there won't be once that service grant has been fulfilled.
Okay. So as we sort of move on, there's a couple of things to hit on here to talk about, so how is this done, or how can this be done? There's a couple elements. I mean, there's the data analysis portion, which we can do, and put that into a CSV for further analysis. But there's a lot of, as we learned with the challenge process, there's a lot of communication back and forth and tracking that needs to be done for an exercise like this. So, we have the Broadband Navigator at Sanborn that we use in the challenge process, and we've added a lot of functionality to help support this. So as we sort of talk about the Broadband Navigator, it's really a communication and administrative tool, and it's really focused on specifically dealing with broadband data such as this. And so again, going back to, you need a tool, or it's good to have a tool that really helps facilitate this process. As David sort of talked through this, we pull a lot of different data sets, we investigate them, we put sort of a score on a location, and then there's ones in the middle. There's ones that are absolutely BSLs and ones that we're really very confident they're not. But there's ones that need adjudication by folks. And so in order to do that, you'll need communication within your broadband office back and forth. And so the Broadband Navigator is set up to do that. And so we really want to stress that there's a lot of communication and administrative function that goes with this that's really important. And as we sort of look at sort of what can the Navigator do, the visualization of the analytical output. So everything that we're talking about through this process can be visualized in a mapping tool. Obviously, we prefer the Broadband Navigator, but that's not required. Filtering and selecting locations based on common characteristics. Again, so can you go in and investigate the data once we put it in there and be able to sort of manipulate it and better understand it. Again, talking about this administrative and communication tool, the assignment of reviews and reviewers or different tasks, all that's built into the Navigator so that you can track it and then have a log so that you can have outputs that show this is how this decision was arrived at. And then centralizing all that information together, because as David, you mentioned, this information has to go eventually over to NTIA so that they can see, why these BSLs were coded the way that they're coded. And, the automated challenge creation. And so again, that sort of goes to part of this can be automated. There is a human element to it, but staying organized, I think is really one of the really important pieces of this. And so, you know, I'm sure there's some folks watching today that have used and have had experience with the Navigator. And I think it's these improvements in the platform are really going to make this a much better experience while the broadband office is trying to do so many things at this point in time with the BEAD program. So with that, Caitlin, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Justin. So the workflow in the Navigator dashboard consists of 4 steps. So we have the analysis, the review, the decision, and the challenge. So moving right into the analysis, all these mischaracterized BSLs that have been identified through the analysis will be put into a dashboard for user review. Some of you on this call might be familiar with this dashboard from the BEAD challenge process, but many of you are probably not. Here in this list, these are a list of locations that have been identified as mischaracterized BSLs. You can see all their accompanying information, their address, their location ID, location type, county, reason code, and most importantly, you will see a score field. This score has been applied to rank the BSL in terms of certainty of it being a mischaracterized BSL. And what I mean by this is that we took all those data sets that we discussed in the beginning, the parcels, the building footprints, and David put it through this analysis. And then these BSLs are ranked from high to low. And the highest score here are those locations that we are basically certain are mischaracterized BSLs. And the lowest score are those that would require some additional review. And the user can do that additional review right here in the dashboard. Any of these fields can be sorted or filtered using the SQL style filter that's built into the dashboard. This filter was built as a lesson learned from the challenge process. We realized how important it is to be able to filter these large data sets so you can review just the BSLs of interest. And given that we're seeing numbers of like 50,000 to 60,000 locations that require review, it's really important to be able to filter by just those fields of interest. So if you, for instance, want to filter by, let's say, scores of over 5 in Orange County, you can do that here. Here, I have filtered by where the location type is equal to utility or secondary structure. In the dashboard, you also have the option to do assignment with users. So any people in your organization that are assigned, you can do assignment either one at a time or in bulk. And then any user in your organization that is assigned can come in here, select the assigned to me, and view just those assignments that are assigned to them. And this is really helpful for these large data sets for managing them, because it makes sure that not only is everyone working in the same place, but that everyone is working on their assignments only. Moving into review, once the user has decided what they are reviewing, they can select the BSL from their list in the dashboard. And this side panel appears with all the information they need to review on that BSL. So here you'll see a map and you'll see the selected location, and then the parcels, imagery, and a full BSL layer. The user can zoom in and out to view the location, and the reason code, location type, and confidence score are going to be listed here as well. So here you can see that this location has a confidence score of 10. So we are basically certain that this location is a mischaracterized BSL. You can also see here on the bottom, you can see that there's an activity log and a comment section. These comments are preloaded with the location. So here you can see there's a location from us from AppGeo that states that this location is in a parcel with another BSL that is served and has a smaller, less complex footprint than a primary BSL. You can also use the Navigator to collect feedback from ISPs. Trying to manage 12 different streams of information coming from different sources across the state is really challenging. So we are trying to streamline the information gathering process by leveraging the functionality in the Navigator that we used in the challenge process. So the portal has been redesigned so ISPs can provide location feedback with notes, location types, or reason codes. And you can see that here. This can be seen with this ISP comment. This ISP has submitted a comment on this location that this is not a serviceable location. So if the automated review and the ISP comments all agree, states can be fairly confident that this location should not receive funding. On the other hand, if they disagree, the location will need to go through some more review. Here, the ISP comment and the Sanborn analysis seem to agree that this is a mischaracterized BSL and this location does not require funding. You can see our confidence score is 10. You can see the ISP says that this is not a serviceable location. We can make the assumption that, hey, this location does not need any sort of BEAD funding. Users can also add comments of their own to the BSL, which they can do through this add a comment feature. And these comments can be used for internal use and evaluation. And they can do so through this activity section by pressing save, and the comment will get added there. So from this screen, the users can decide to challenge or dismiss this location. So if the user selects challenge, which they can do by selecting those three dots on the top, and you'll see that little drop down. If they select challenge, the location is moved to another queue in the dashboard. And that's where it can be exported into that FP no BEAD location CSV that David mentioned. This CSV will show a list of locations that your office deems as a mischaracterized BSLs that need to be challenged with the FCC. If the user decides to dismiss the location will be moved to another queue where users can return and challenge the location, or they can just leave the location for no further review. And moving into challenge. So those locations that users have decided to challenge can be found in this challenge queue here, which you can see up on the top. And when a user is ready to export these locations, they can select the export all challenge locations, which is here. And these locations will be exported into that FP no BEAD challenge CSV, like the one that's shown here below. The CSV will then be used in your final proposal submission. Locations exported will be blocked from any further action in the dashboard. Through this interface, you can take all these locations that are flagged for review by the Sandboard analysis and completely review and export them into your FP no BEAD location CSV for use in your final proposal. And you can do this all in one place, which is really convenient. And I'm going to pass it back over to Justin to talk a little bit more about some of the benefits here.
Thanks, Caitlin. So really kind of recapping, we really talked about the sort of the problem statement of the mischaracterized BSLs. David went through the data analytics behind it to improve the number of accurate BSLs that are eligible for BEAD funding. And Caitlin just talked through, sort of how we've designed our Broadband Navigator mapping platform to visualize as well as help with communication and adjudication of these locations. And so now we get to the point of, okay, so what? We touched on this kind of at the beginning, but what are the benefits, and are the benefits great enough to take the endeavor to sort of go down this road into identifying mischaracterized BSLs? And so really, the effort really is worth it. And so if we go to the next slide, and I really want to bring you in here, David. We found large percentages of these BSLs that are mischaracterized, and as we sort of pointed out as we went through the different examples, a lot of these are very high cost locations that otherwise would be required to be served under BEAD. And through this data analysis, we see that really that money can be used more effectively for other uses by the state. So with that, I'll just kick it over to you to really talk about the benefits here, because this is sort of, very important part of all this is what is the state going to get out of it?
I mean, the biggest thing, and we've already mentioned it, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but the biggest thing is that you're going to have the opportunity to get fiber to more homes within your original plan. And that means it's depending on where a state is in their sub-grantee selection. Have they already created project areas? Everyone's at different spots here. And so it's going to be a different point of intervention. It might be that, you've already gone through round one, you've chosen some bidders, and you're going to have to do negotiation with them on these locations. At that point, it gives you a step up or a foot up on the provider so that you're not just depending on them for this information. You could go through sub-grantee selection and have all of your locations bidded out, but you haven't had this discussion with the provider. The providers might come back and say, okay, we can't serve this one. We don't need to serve that one. We don't have to serve this one. And then you have a couple weeks to suddenly get your final proposal together and figure out how all of this is working. At that point, you need this data set so that you have leverage, so that you can communicate clearly and you can get to the best data. Where we've done this process in whole is with CPF projects, and the ability to go back and forth with an ISP has really, it's been amazing how they get better, right? Once you give them a heads up that, hey, we think that this location that we're going to give you money for is not real, but you also might be missing this one over here. We're not sure. And going through that back and forth really gets the ISP looking at the data, thinking about it. And in some cases, they've even come back and said, you know what, actually, there's not a lot for us to do over here. We're going to get these 2 locations instead of those 500 that you had planned. And so I think the first thing is having that position of strength as a state so that you can make sure that when you're talking to states, or excuse me, when you're talking to ISPs, you know what you're doing, where you're at, and you know what the ISP needs to respond to. I think that's really important. But if you're much earlier in the process, this is a game changer in terms of being able to design your project areas a little bit different if you have that option in your volume too. But make sure that you're adjusting your project areas so that it's accounting for the locations that are actually there. You didn't just create this huge project area somewhere because of a shed in the woods way in the north of that census block group. So it helps you there. And then I think, coming back to it, just being able to more effectively make decisions and bring that all together so that you're making consistent decisions, I think is really important. Because by creating a standardized data set like this, you're able to then say, okay, we're going to review it too. We're going to look at it. But as we look at them, we look at all of the reason code 1, location type U locations. And based on that, you can go through and say, you know what? I'm not comfortable with these. I think, as there was a question in the Q&A, which I'm now thinking I shouldn't have answered while Caitlin was speaking so that we could talk about them together. But there was a question in the Q&A about what about tribal regions and what that should have 2 BSLs in 1 parcel. There are a lot of ways to deal with that. There are a lot of things that we need to do. We need to talk to the state and get that extra information. But the benefit here of having all of that data collected is that you can look at the data, you can see what type of parcels were collected where, what type of distances from roadways were judged as X and Y, and use that decision-making matrix that is already there for you and adjust it if you need to. You can make those changes to be able to say, you know what, we like this in general, but in these cases, we think there's an issue, so we want you to adjust this way. And that's going to be really easy to handle in the navigator. So I think you get that better information, puts you in a better position, then you use that to plan more effectively, and then you use it to make more effective decisions.
David, I want to come back to it because you did just talk about it, but I think it's worth highlighting. If I'm sitting sort of listening to this webinar, and I'm thinking, was it too late for me to do this? And I know you kind of hit on it, but there is a best case scenario of when to do it, but all the scenarios that you went over, doing this exercise and this analysis will improve your final proposal and improve ultimately your BEAD program. So I just want to retouch on that there are many points in time, up until your final proposal, that this analysis can be done. So it's not too late in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, the best time for us to do this was in 2022. When the first version of the fabric came out, and I see names in the participants that go to NISJIC and probably heard me scream about this problem and how the NTIA and FCC were incentivizing a unidirectional fabric challenge process where people only wanted to add locations. And that made sense because it was going to affect their funding. But for 2 years, we want more, and nobody checked where we should be going back. Nobody was looking for locations that should be removed. And so that, it's never too late to make data better. And I think that as much as we can, we want to be trying to make a final push to improve that data set, because who knows what else it'll be used for in the future. But right now, we just need to make sure that we're not wasting money on funding rock.
Thanks, David. If we're just go to the last slide so folks can kind of copy down any contact information for us. You can, if you have additional questions, you can reach out to Priya or Jenna. Either one of those folks would be more than happy to get back to you on your questions. David, I think, as you mentioned, you answered a number of questions within the Q&A And so are there any of those that I'd like to go over, but are there any of those that stood out that are sort of ones we could kick off
Well,
in Q&A for the
I
group?
think they were all great points, but two of them are very similar in that, hey, states are different. You can't apply one analysis to every state and get good data, right? And I think that is true, but you can get really close. You just need to then find ways to adjust that data. And so this isn't, we don't do this uniformly. Every state gets exactly the same thing. We have a base analysis, and then we work with states to find out what their concerns are. Some states, on the coast have a lot of islands, and that's a particular focus for them. They know they're going to be very high cost. They need to try and balance which islands are actually have utilities and which ones don't. And so, that's a different piece of the analysis that we have to tweak and manage. And so I think every state's going to be different. The data sources available are different. We have ways of dealing with some of that, right? We have a partner that we work with for parcels that provides very good data. We do some of our own feature extraction to cover where building footprints were not extracted correctly. But then the rest of that is just, of course, we need your help. Like, we don't know everything about everywhere, but we have a good base process that is ready to go and then can be tweaked and managed to make sure that we're accounting for all of the things that you as a state know more about than us and are concerned about and want to make sure is accounted for.
And sort of, David, can we dive into a little bit? Obviously, this needs to be packaged up for NTIA and FCC. Just talk about how we've thought through that, and then this process does include getting that data ready for evidence for NTIA, but also to submit it to FCC.
Yeah, and so it's important to note that we also do this differently with different states depending on what they need. And so there are states that we're working with where we're building the navigator to do all of this work and allow them to bring in ISP feedback and view the notes and view it on the map. And I think that's really useful. That's how I would want it. That's why we're doing it, is because I looked at it and was like, man, if I was still working for a state GIS office, this would be a nightmare unless you have one repository where all of this stuff can go. But every office is different and they have different capacities. If you're cool with just having that tabular data, we want to support that too. And either way, what we can do is make sure that the data account leads to an output that is what you need for your final proposal, the FP no BEAD locations.csv, and also your FCC challenges, when and where you need to file them. Those aren't going to be completely related, in that FCC challenges don't need to be filed, for example, if the location has been removed from the fabric, or if you're putting a location under reason code 3, which is that the location is actually served by a private network. So those things won't always align. And as one of the questioners asked, the evidence types aren't the same. Everything isn't going to match up, but that's why as we do this analysis, we prepare all of the evidence types for each location that is eligible, regardless of the final decision, regardless of the score we give it. We just pull all of those things that you would be able to use so that you have an extracted building footprint. You have the most recent satellite imagery. You have a Google Street View if it's available. You have all of those things that we can possibly pull together and find ways of collecting as much data as possible. And again, that's something we'd work with states on to see if you want to try and get local government attestations. That's something we can work on developing a workflow for as well. So it's all about just pulling it into those CSVs at the end. If you have the Navigator version of this, then it's as easy as clicking a button and it'll just pop all of that stuff out for you. But if we're just running the analysis, it's easy for us to create that as well.
And as was kind of inferred in the question, there are different standards, right, for NTIA and FCC, and you can have your evidence submitted into NTIA. It doesn't have to before NTIA has its own criteria and acceptance then you would submit it into FCC to approve the map, obviously. But it doesn't have to be adjudicated by FCC for NTIA to accept it, right? I just want to make sure that because there's always questions around sort of the FCC's role or non-role in these things.
Yeah. So the FCC requirement is just that a challenge has been filed and you have the ID, the challenge ID. The NTIA knows that the requirements are not the same. And what they're expecting is that they can view what type of evidence you have and the location codes that you have and make sense of it, and it seems reasonable, et cetera, before they, start poking at your data. That they've stated that they don't want to do that. They don't want to go in and look at all of the data, but they just want to be able to see that everything looks reasonable. I'm sure they will, in some cases, be checking this data. So you got to have the evidence prepared, obviously. But for the FCC's purpose, it's just submitting that challenge. Even if the FCC does adjudicate it and they adjudicate against your challenge, that doesn't mean that the NTIA won't accept what you put in the FP, no BEAD location stuff.
All right. We'll open it up for a minute for any additional questions. I think we've kind of touched on the existing questions here in the Q&A. Let's see if anyone has anything else to go through. We'll be recording. We're recording this webinar. We'll be posting it on our YouTube page. We'll also be rerunning this webinar in January if you prefer to watch it live again. And so there'll be a couple ways for you to kind of review what we've gone over today. Certainly reach out to Priya and Jenna to have further discussions and to kind of get into even more detail than we've gotten into today. And hopefully we can work with a number of the folks on the phone to really dig into your state data. And again, there is a process. We've developed this data set several times. We have to dial it in for each unique circumstance in each state. And so, this is an effort where we work very closely with state folks to make sure that the analysis is providing what you're looking for based on your unique circumstances. And through all this BEAD work, we know that each state has different things that need to be paid attention to that might not be relevant in other states. So we look forward to having additional conversations with folks. And David, I think another question just came into the Q&A.
So again, the FCC does not need to approve your challenges. If you're talking about the NTIA evidentiary standards, none of those things are always required. So they list the possible types of evidence, and from discussions with the NTIA, they want to see as much evidence as possible, as many times as possible, but there is no rule about including all of them every time. So if there's solid evidence without getting a property owner attestation, it's reasonable, right? And so it's going to be a matter of making sure that you have as much evidence as possible, rather than, hey, we always have to have a field visit or a property owner attestation.
So more data is better if it's good data, but more information is good. But it's really making the case that it's reasonable that the state has made the decision. This is a mischaracterized BSL. All right, I'll give it one more second to see if we have any other questions. Otherwise, want to thank everyone for joining us today, and please reach out if you have additional questions. We can really dig into more of the details around this analysis, and we'll be posting this webinar on our YouTube page, as well as rerunning it again in January live. So I don't see any more questions. So I want to really thank David thank you for really leading us here on this this webinar and going through the data analytics. And I want to thank Caitlin for going through how all those data analytics can be go into the navigator and make that administrative and communication process easier. And so I want to thank you both. And with that, have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.